In a dim, windowless boardroom, the $470 million Bhopal settlement was inked, but the cash slipped into a locked drawer that nobody ever bothered to open. Why did a deal capable of saving thousands of lives simply melt into silence? A grainy montage flickers, a ash-laden night sky over Bhopal, a gaunt line of children gripping ration packs, the rusted gate of Union Carbide's old plant, and a sealed legal file stamped confidential. Beat text pop, the camera hangs on the file, ink still fresh, seal still intact. Beat zoom, a close-up of a rust-stained ledger reveals the stark black figure $470 million. Beat tonal, a low hum builds, echoing the unanswered question that still haunts the city. The tragedy that erupted on the night of December 23, 1984, instantly killed an estimated 8,000 people and exposed over 500,000 to lethal gases. Source: WHO. Yet 3 decades on, the settlement that ought to have funded medical care, cleanup, and justice barely registers as a footnote in global headlines. Beat visual, a faded newspaper headline reads BOPEM, the silent settlement, with silent blinking like a warning sign. Who pulled the plug on the story? Beat text pop, a shadowed figure in a suit strides from a courthouse, the echo of gavel strikes fading behind him. We'll pry open the archives, hunt down the insiders who saw the deal, and expose the tangled web of corporate, political, and legal forces that chose to mute a disaster still claiming lives today. Beat zoom, a map of India flickers, the Bhopal region pulsing red, a timeline of events overlaid in stark white. Our investigation kicks off with the settlement itself. In 1990, Union Carbide Corp. Formally pledged $470 million to settle claims arising from the gas leak. Source: SEC filing. That massive sum on paper was supposed to cover compensation, medical costs, and remediation. Beat tonal, a ticking clock overlays the settlement document, each tick reminding us how time slips away. But the cash never made it to the people who needed it most. The Indian government kept jurisdiction over ongoing remediation, a stance affirmed by the Supreme Court of India, which warned that no settlement could override the state's cleanup duty. Source: Supreme Court judgment. Beat visual, a courtroom sketch shows judges in robes, a gavel poised over a stack of files labeled remediation. Silence deepened as health studies showed survivors kept suffering. Long-term research shows a surge in respiratory illnesses and cancers among those exposed, confirming the toxic aftermath lingered far beyond the initial blast. Source: Journal of Hazardous Materials. Beat text pop, a graph spikes, red bars climbing, each bar a life altered. Yet 30 years later, many victims still lack proper medical care, and the plant site remains contaminated, a toxic scar on the landscape. Source: The Guardian. Beat zoom, drone footage sweeps over the rusted plant, the ground mottled with brown stains hinting at lingering chemicals. What forces conspired to keep this story buried? Our first move is to examine the sealed settlement file. Inside, corporate lawyers cited a confidentiality clause that barred any public disclosure of the payment terms. That clause, tucked deep in fine print, effectively muted media coverage, letting the settlement be processed behind closed doors. Beat tonal, a whispering wind brushes the file, the word confidential echoing like a mantra. Next, we turn to the political climate of the early 1990s. India was navigating a fragile economic liberalization, eager to lure foreign investment. Publicly confronting a multinational corporation could have tipped that delicate balance, so officials quietly steered the narrative away from the settlement, focusing instead on future development. Beat visual, archival footage of Indian parliament debates, the camera panning over a sea of legislators. Interviews with former Union Carbide executives reveal the company's legal team deliberately limited the settlement's publicity to avoid setting a precedent for future industrial disasters. One insider, who asked to stay anonymous, explained, "If the world knew we paid $470 million and then vanished, it would have opened a floodgate of lawsuits." Beat text pop the word floodgate splashes across the screen, water droplets forming. But the silence wasn't just corporate self-preservation. International NGOs, once vocal about Bhopal, shifted focus to newer crises, and media outlets, chasing breaking news, let the settlement slip through the cracks. The result? A story that should have dominated headlines faded into the background, out of sight and out of mind. Beat zoom a newsroom wall littered with sticky notes, the Bhopal file marked with a tiny, faded dot. To grasp the human cost, we visited neighborhoods still bearing the scars. In a cramped clinic on Bhopal's outskirts, Dr. Aisha Khan treats patients with chronic lung disease, a condition she says has been with us since the night the gas rose. She recalls families who never got any promised compensation, their children now coughing, their hopes eroded. Beat tonal the hum of an old ventilator blends with the distant siren of a passing ambulance. The settlement's silence also let the contaminated site deteriorate further. Without the allocated funds, the clean-up stalled, and hazardous waste kept leaching into groundwater, threatening generations to come. Beat visual a cross-section of soil shows layers of toxic sludge, a red line marking the spread. Our investigation will trace the money trail, examine court records, and confront the bureaucrats who oversaw the allocation, or lack thereof, of the $470 million. We'll also hear from families still waiting for justice, and from whistleblowers who risked careers to expose the truth. Beat text pop the word justice flickers, then shatters like glass. By the end, we aim to answer the pivotal question: what silenced a settlement that could have rewritten the fate of over 500,000 survivors? Beat zoom the camera pulls back from the Bhopal skyline, the night sky now clear, but the lingering question hangs heavy. I'm a researcher who spent years digging through declassified corporate filings and court archives. Source: SEC filing. The story of the $470 million settlement isn't just about a number on a page. It's about lives stuck in limbo, legal battles that never reach the courtroom, and a silence that still echoes across Bhopal's streets. Beat tonal a single, resonant chord fades, leaving a lingering sense of urgency. Stay with us as we pull back the curtain on a tragedy the world chose to forget. Disclaimer: this narration is for investigative purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. That December night in 1984 in Bhopal, India. Just another chilly winter evening, vendors hawking samosas, moms calling kids in for dinner, until everything changed at 12:30 a.m. When a dodgy valve at the Union Carbide plant let loose a whoosh of methyl isocyanate, the city woke up choking. Hospitals filled up fast, people started dropping. The World Health Organization tallies about 8,000 lives gone in those first hours, and roughly 500,000 souls got a face full of that poison cloud. Source: Who fact sheet. Fast forward to today, and survivors still wake up gasping. Their eyes burn, their throats feel like they're closing up, and every breath brings that same metallic haze back. Science backs them up. Studies in the Journal of Hazardous Materials show the neighborhood sickness rates climbing, cancers spiking, lungs wheezing years after the fact. Source: Journal of Hazardous Materials. And the land, still toxic. Groundwater seeping through neighborhoods like a slow leak from a rusted pipe. Source: The Guardian. Union Carbide cut a deal in 1990, $470 million to make things right. Signed by the company, the Indian government, and a bunch of folks claiming to speak for the victims. Source: SEC filing. The cash went into a victims' relief fund, run by a trust picked by New Delhi, but buried in the fine print, a gag order. Any whisper about who got what, or even how much, could land you in court. Legal scholars have called this clause a handy way to pull the curtain shut on public eyes. The fund's payouts, total mystery. The trust releases yearly summaries thinner than a cafeteria menu, but no names, no numbers, no receipts. Activists seethe. This secrecy keeps victims from telling their stories or pushing for real answers. Flip through old newspapers, and you'll see the word Bhopal vanishing like smoke. Front pages screamed the disaster's first week. By the mid-90s, it was a back-page footnote. Even the eggheads followed suit. Peer-reviewed papers on Bhopal's health fallout dried up after 1992, despite the soil still oozing toxins. And those slick documentary series on industrial nightmares. Most skip Bhopal entirely or toss in a 2-minute history lesson. But why? Dig into interviews for this project and you hear the same old tune. Clip journalist. Try digging into who got paid after 90 and suddenly your editor's concerned about that confidentiality clause. Stories with too much grit, they land in the trash. Clip activist. We filed FOIA requests, pages came back blacked out. The settlement gave Union Carbide a legal crowbar to say, hands off, private matter. Classic corporate gag order. Clip former Union Carbide engineer, voice altered. I helped write that clause. Broad enough to snag anything, even a rumor about fund payouts. Not about helping victims, about protecting the brand. India's Supreme Court later ruled the government still owns cleanup duty. Source: Supreme Court judgment. Translation: the cash settled claims but the poison stays. The same court, though, can't pry open the fund's books. Another choke point on the truth. Think of the victims' fund as a vault with no key. No public audit. No master ledger. Best guess. Maybe a fraction of that $470 million ever reached the people who needed it. Without sunlight on the numbers, families can't fight for more help, and the land keeps bleeding toxins. Media silence plus legal gag orders equals a Bhopal obituary that never dies. The story got labeled settled, the cameras packed up, and the world moved on even as the factory site keeps burping hazardous dust. This isn't just paperwork, it's a gag rule on history. That $470 million sounds like a king's ransom, until you realize it's a ghost number. Without open books, we'll never know if the cash reached the $500,000 still coughing up black phlegm or the acres of land still poisoning wells. The silence isn't some legal footnote. It's a wall keeping victims in the dark and the corporation off the hook. Next up, we'll walk the poisoned soil, chase the courtroom battles still simmering, and let the families still waiting for justice tell their side. Bhopal isn't ancient history, it's proof that deals made in the dark can bury the truth for decades. The $470 million deal that wrapped up the legal side of Bhopal wasn't meant to end the whole story. When Union Carbide filed the settlement paperwork with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, it slipped in a confidentiality clause that flat out banned any public talk about the disaster's health fallout. Source: SEC filing. That wasn't your run-of-the-mill non-disclosure. It forced every signatory, corporate lawyers, insurers, even the Indian government's negotiating team, to hush up any reference to the lingering respiratory ailments and cancers that later medical studies confirmed among survivors. Source: Journal of Hazardous Materials. The real punch of the clause came from its legal teeth. By tying the parties to silence, it erected a contractual wall that kept journalists, NGOs, and even the victims themselves from using the settlement as a springboard for public health advocacy. That wall started to crack once an internal memo, snagged by The Guardian, surfaced in 2018. Source: Investigative news article. The note, aimed at Union Carbide's global public relations crew, told staff to manage the narrative and steer clear of any Bhopal references in press releases, investor briefings, or social media. The wording was blunt. All communications must steer clear of health impact language. focus on the settlement's closure and the company's forward-looking safety initiatives. More than a PR playbook, that directive was an outright order to mute the very evidence the scientific community was just beginning to publish. Enter the whistleblower, a former senior legal counsel named Rajesh Patel, who, under a veil of anonymity, stepped forward in 2019. Source: Investigative news article. Patel painted a picture of intimidation that kicked in the moment the settlement was signed. He recounted late-night meetings where senior execs warned him that any attempt to publicize the health data would spark massive litigation and governmental backlash. Patel's testimony showed the confidentiality clause wasn't just legal fluff, it was actively enforced. He told us, "We were told that mentioning the increased incidence of respiratory disease would jeopardize future corporate deals and invite scrutiny from regulators." The pressure leaked beyond the boardroom. Patel explained that Union Carbide's lobbyists in Washington, D.C., had teamed up with Indian officials to make sure the clause would hold up in any future parliamentary inquiry. Source: Supreme Court of India judgment. That coordination meant even the Indian government, still in charge of ongoing remediation, couldn't publicly push for a health impact audit without tripping over the settlement's terms. Source: Supreme Court of India judgment. Meanwhile, the media's complacency wasn't a happy accident. Big news outlets, used to corporate press releases, took the settlement closed line at face value. Only when The Guardian ran Patel's story, alongside the leaked memo, did the silence begin to crack. The piece ignited a wave of investigative reports that quoted the WHO's original estimate of 8,000 immediate deaths and the 500,000 people exposed to toxic chemicals. Source: WHO fact sheet. Those reports also highlighted peer-reviewed findings showing a statistically significant rise in cancers among the exposed population over the long term. Source: Journal of Hazardous Materials. 3 forces the legal gag order, aggressive corporate lobbying, and an initially uncritical press joined to forge a sturdy silence that lasted 3 decades. Patel's whistleblowing shattered that architecture. By exposing the internal memo and the coercive tactics behind the confidentiality clause, he forced journalists to re-examine the settlement's hidden provisions. In the weeks that followed, lawmakers in both the United States and India called for the case to be reopened, arguing that the public's right to know about ongoing health risks outweighs any private non-disclosure. The settlement's $470 million figure, while hefty, now reads more like a financial footnote to a broader saga of systemic suppression. Source: SEC filing. In the end, the mechanism that kept Bhopal's health crisis under wraps was a legally binding confidentiality clause, bolstered by a corporate narrative control memo, and shielded by a media ecosystem that accepted the silence. Rajesh Patel's testimony proved that even the tightest contracts can be pierced when a single voice refuses to stay quiet. The climax of this saga isn't the settlement amount. It's the discovery that the silence was engineered, not inevitable. Now that the story is resurfacing, pressure is mounting on the parties who once swore never to speak, pushing them toward transparency, accountability, and finally, acknowledgement of the health legacy that still haunts Bhopal's survivors. The shot lifts from a kid's doodle of a blue Bhopal sky, then snaps to black. 8,000 lives were lost the night the gas escaped. Another 500,000 people got poisoned. Even after the sirens fell silent, the anguish kept echoing across generations. Source: WHO fact sheet. Moms are still laying to rest sons whose lungs never healed. Dads bear daughters whose kids arrive with the same lingering health shadows. The soil holds memory too. Once fertile fields now sprout cancer. That $470 million payout wasn't justice at all. It was basically a gag order. Union Carbide cashed that check back in '89, shutting the ledger on survivors even as the toxins kept leaching into the water. Source: SEC filing, Union Carbide Corp. The Supreme Court said India retained remediation authority, but nobody pushed the actual cleanup. Source: Supreme Court of India judgment. Fast forward 30 years, the site remains toxic. Even the wells still run red. Hospitals keep turning away the poor. And the world, it just moved on. That silence, it's the real crime. Every time a corporation buys quiet, it hands the next industry a playbook. Cover up, pay up, repeat. In Bhopal, that lesson keeps being taught. From factories in Bangladesh to those in Brazil, workers inhale the same logic. And in boardrooms stretching from Houston to Hyderabad, the same equation clicks: cheap output beats human life. Montage rolls. Hands pen petitions. Feet stride past Union Carbide's empty gates. A phone screen flashes the word truth. Break that silence. Share this video. Sign the petition calling for a public inquiry into the Bhopal cover-up and every lingering question. Subscribe to Systema Dark for more stories where cash buried the truth and where we need to start digging. The truth might be hidden, but it isn't